Every single satisfying in Resident Evil, every outbreak, every mutant, every city reduced to ash traces back to one man, not a monster, not a tyrant. An old man in a wheelchair who decided that humanity wasn't good enough. Today I'm breaking down every hidden backstory in the entire Resident Evil franchise and everything we know about them. Starting with the guy who built the machine that turned everyone else into monsters, Oswell E. Spencer. Resident Evil's greatest villain never mutated on screen. Let that sink in. While every other antagonist in this franchise eventually transforms into some grotesque final boss, Spencer just sat there pulling strings, convinced he was God's architect. And honestly, his actual plan was worse than anything a mutant could do. Here's the thing. Spencer didn't stumble onto the progenitor virus by accident. In the late 1960s, he funded an expedition into West Africa specifically hunting for it. And when he established Umbrella's first research facilities in 1968, selling bioweapons was never the end game. That was just the revenue stream. His real goal was forced evolution. Unleash his viruses on the entire human population, let most of them die, then rule over whatever survivors crawled out as their creator. He literally wanted to architect a new species with himself on top, forever. To get there, he authorized experiments on children, prisoners, entire villages. Not as unfortunate side effects, but as deliberate steps toward his vision of perfected humanity. But here's where the irony gets thick. Spencer, the man who spent decades trying to force humanity to evolve, ended up old, frail, and confined to a wheelchair. Wesker shoved his hand straight through Spencer's chest in his own estate. The guy who wanted to be a god couldn't even keep himself standing, and Spencer's influence didn't die with him. Not even close, because the connections he built, the ideologies he planted, they spread like a virus of their own. The connections. Here's the thing about Umbrella. Everyone treats them like the final boss. The big evil corporation pulling every string, running every experiment, poisoning every city. And for a while that tracks. But then you start digging into the connections, and you realize something genuinely unsettling. Umbrella's downfall didn't end anything. It just created a power vacuum, and the Connections walked right into it. The Connections were a criminal organization that swooped in after Umbrella's bankruptcy and seized its assets, not some scrappy startup. A fully operational syndicate that absorbed Umbrella's research, its networks, and its supply chains like a parasite latching onto a fresh corpse. And their ideology? They didn't have one. Zero. No grand vision of human transcendence, no delusional god complex, just money. Pure, nihilistic greed wearing a very expensive suit. They took everything Umbrella built and kept the machine running. All that effort to bring Umbrella down, all those sacrifices and the Connections just picked up where they left off. They coordinated bioweapon proliferation across the global black market like it was a stock portfolio. As long as bioweapons kept changing hands, the Connections kept profiting. And this is where it gets really dark. Destroying Umbrella accomplished nothing. The heroes dismantled the corporation, celebrated the victory, and the underlying market for bioweapons kept humming along like nothing happened. The demand was permanent. The supply chain was permanent. Umbrella was just one storefront, and the new owners had already moved in. Their operational security was so airtight that no confirmed leaders, no headquarters, no faces. Just money flowing in the right directions and bodies piling up in the wrong ones. That's the real horror of Resident Evil. Not a monster in a lab. A spreadsheet in a boardroom. But if faceless corporate greed sounds bad, wait until you meet the guy who turned military loyalty into a personal bioweapon empire, Sergei Vladimir. Here's the thing about Umbrella's downfall. Everyone loves to blame the scientists, the corporate executives, the guys in lab coats making monsters in basements, but nobody talks about the men in uniform who saw those monsters and thought, I could use that. Sergei Vladimir was a former Soviet military officer who climbed the ranks inside Umbrella itself, not a scientist, not a pencil-pushing executive. A soldier who founded the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service and used his paramilitary authority to become one of the corporation's most powerful loyalists, because Vladimir recognized something most people in his position pretended not to see. Bioweapon technology wasn't just a scientific breakthrough, it was a shortcut to power that no amount of metals could ever match. So he started leveraging. After Umbrella's public collapse, Vladimir took the corporation's remaining assets and ran black market bioweapon operations out of Russia around 2003. TALOS combat data, experimental strains, materials that could level cities. He maintained entire shadow networks while positioning himself as the last true guardian of Umbrella's legacy. He wasn't breaking the system. He was the system, just redirecting it for himself. And that's the part that should genuinely bother you. Vladimir's story doesn't just expose one corrupt officer. It proves that the institutions supposedly controlling bioweapon proliferation are themselves the threat. Umbrella's own paramilitary leadership enforced containment protocols with one hand and sold the products with the other. Governments weren't victims of bioweapon leaks. They were customers. Vladimir eventually got consumed by the very biological forces he tried to weaponize, which is, not ideal. But every single character who tries to harness something they can't control ends up becoming the thing they wanted to control. Everyone. But at least Vladimir only destroyed himself. The next family on our list managed to turn genetic obsession into a multi-generational nightmare that makes his ambitions look almost quaint. The Ashford family. Most families have skeletons in the closet. The Ashfords had an entire genetic research program in theirs. Alfred and Alexia Ashford weren't just wealthy heirs to a bioweapon dynasty. They operated under a genuine, fully committed delusion that their bloodline represented a proto-species, a superior genetic lineage destined to inherit the Earth after regular humanity inevitably wiped itself out. Not a metaphor, not an exaggeration. They believed they were the next step in human evolution, and they had the money and the facilities to act on it. Here's where it gets dark, and I mean really dark. Alexia voluntarily injected herself with the T. Veronica virus at approximately age 17. Then she entered cryogenic sleep for 15 years to let the virus slowly fuse with her body. Let that sink in. A teenager decided on her own to turn herself into a bioweapon and take a decade-and-a-half nap to make it work. That's not science. That's a 17-year-old with a god complex and zero adult supervision, which is somehow worse than it sounds. And the family dysfunction didn't stop there. Alfred and Alexia were actually created as test tube experiments by their father Alexander, engineered from the DNA of their ancestor Veronica Ashford in pursuit of genetic perfection. The entire family structure was warped beyond recognition by their father's obsession with hereditary superiority. Alfred, left behind while his sister slept in a freezer, became profoundly psychologically damaged. He couldn't function independently. He developed a split personality, dressing as Alexia and speaking in her voice, violently lashing out at anyone who threatened the twisted fantasy he'd built around her eventual return. This is what happens when corporate greed puts on a family mask. When wealth meets, ideology meets zero accountability. The Ashfords didn't just fund bioweapon research. They became the research. They turned their own children into experiments and called it destiny. But if the Ashfords represent genetic aristocracy eating itself alive, the next name on this list took that same obsession with transcendence and made it somehow even more unhinged. Alex Wesker. Here's the thing about destroying Umbrella. Everyone celebrated. The corporation responsible for Raccoon City, for the T-Virus, for decades of human experimentation was finally gone, dismantled, finished, and it changed absolutely nothing. Alex Wesker is the proof. She shares a genetic connection to Albert Wesker, and whether that link is familial or engineered through one of Spencer's projects, the result is identical. She inherited the same obsession with transcendence, the same conviction that humanity in its current form is a rough draft waiting to be edited. Umbrella didn't teach her this. She breathes it, and that's what makes her terrifying. Not her intelligence, not her resources, not even the bioweapons she developed. It's the fact that she exists at all. Umbrella is dust. Spencer is dead. Albert is dead. The infrastructure is gone, but the gospel survived. The idea that catastrophic biological transformation is an acceptable price for evolution, that human suffering is just collateral on the road to something greater, that idea didn't die with the company, it just found a new host. Alex actively pursued dangerous parasitic organisms specifically because they were unpredictable. She didn't want controlled results. She wanted chaos with potential. If a parasite could rewrite human biology in ways nobody could anticipate, that wasn't a flaw in her research. That was the point. Predictable science builds medicine. Unpredictable science builds gods. At least that's what she believed. And this is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. You can shut down every lab, arrest every executive, burn every facility to the ground, but you cannot destroy an ideology by destroying a company. Someone will always pick up the torch. Spencer's philosophy became a virus of its own, one that doesn't need a corporate structure to spread. It just needs one person who believes in it badly enough. Alex Wesker was that person, which is, not ideal. But if Alex carried Spencer's philosophy forward willingly, the next name on this list had no such choice. William Birkin didn't inherit an ideology. He got crushed by one. William Birkin. Here's the thing about William Birkin. Every other name on this list either started corrupt or was born into corruption. Birkin didn't. He was a genuine scientist with genuine ambitions. And for roughly 15 years, Umbrella slowly filed those ambitions down into something unrecognizable. He created the G-Virus, not the T-Virus, not some derivative, but a completely new parasitic bioweapon that made everything Umbrella had developed look like a rough draft. It didn't just infect, it evolved. It rewrote its host on a biological level the T-Virus couldn't even approach. This was the next step in bioweapon development, and Birkin knew exactly what that meant. Because when Umbrella's security force came knocking to seize his research, Birkin did something that still stands as the single most desperate act in the entire franchise. He injected himself with the G-Virus. See, Birkin had been planning to sell the G-Virus to the US government, cutting Umbrella out entirely. So Umbrella sent their USS team to take it back by force. And before you frame what happened next as some noble sacrifice, let me be clear. It wasn't. This was a terrified man who saw no remaining option except becoming the thing nobody could control. The logic is horrifying precisely because it makes sense. But here's where it gets devastating. His mutated G-form didn't lose William Birkin entirely. Fragments of his consciousness survived inside the monster, broken pieces of a father's mind rattling around inside something that could tear through concrete, and those fragments locked onto one target, his daughter, Sherry. The creature pursued her relentlessly. Driven by shattered instinct it couldn't understand or override, a father trying to reach his child through a body that could only traumatize her. He couldn't stop it. He couldn't communicate. He could only chase the person he loved most while wearing the shape of her worst nightmare. That's not a villain's backstory. That's a tragedy with teeth. And if Birkin's story feels like the franchise finally making things personal, wait until you meet the woman who built an entire religion around her grief, Mother Miranda. Most cult leaders are just charismatic liars. Mother Miranda is something worse. She's a charismatic liar who might actually believe every word she's saying. Here's the setup. At some point, Miranda discovered a parasitic organism called the mold, a fungal network capable of infiltrating and rewriting human biology from the inside out. Exposure to the mold granted her abilities that, to an uneducated rural population, would look indistinguishable from miracles, healing, longevity, control over the environment. She didn't just stumble into power. She staged it, carefully, deliberately. Every supernatural display, every act of divine intervention, was a calculated performance designed to position herself as the spiritual authority over an entire village. And it worked, for decades. We're not talking about a few years of cult nonsense. Generational succession occurred under her rule. People were born, lived their entire lives, and died without ever knowing a world outside Miranda's authority. That's not leadership, that's ownership. But here's where it gets genuinely disturbing. Miranda's actual goal was never spiritual salvation. It was biological conversion. She was systematically infecting the village population with the mold, turning living human beings into host vessels for a parasitic organism, while framing the entire process as transcendence, as evolution, as being chosen. The villagers didn't resist because they didn't know they were being consumed. They thought they were being saved. And the question nobody can answer definitively is whether Miranda herself still knows the difference. She is simultaneously the mold's host and its instrument. Her apparent humanity, her ability to speak and plan and manipulate, is maintained only through hierarchical control over the very parasite eating her alive. Remove that control structure and there's no telling what's left underneath. Her will and the mold's will have been entangled for so long that separating them might be impossible. She didn't just use religion as a weapon. She became the religion, and the congregation never had a chance. But if a parasitic cult leader sounds bad, wait until you hear about the architect who tried to do the right thing and got buried alive in his own building for it. George Trevor. George Trevor did everything right, and it killed him. Here's the setup. In the late 1960s, Umbrella hires Trevor, a skilled architect, to design what he's told is a cutting-edge research facility. A mansion, laboratories beneath it, complex structural work requiring someone who genuinely understood containment systems and underground construction. Trevor took the job because it was a job. He had zero idea what the facility was actually for. The mansion was completed around 1967, and Trevor moved on with his life. But then Umbrella invited him back. A return visit, maybe additional consultation, maybe a friendly gesture from a generous client, except it wasn't friendly at all. It was a trap. George Trevor knew too much. He designed every corridor, every hidden passage, every structural secret of that facility. And Umbrella couldn't have a loose end like that walking around with a full set of blueprints in his head. So they locked him inside. The man who designed every room of that building was imprisoned within it and left to die. Not executed. Not given some quick ending, left to wander the halls of his own creation, slowly starving, trapped in the very architecture he'd built. His own blueprints became his prison walls. And here's the thing that makes it truly cruel. Trevor tried to use his knowledge of the layout to escape. He designed the place. He knew every trick, every hidden room. It didn't matter. Umbrella had modified the building after his original work. The mansion he remembered and the mansion he was trapped in were no longer the same structure. His expertise was worthless. When players eventually discover his skeletal remains, they're finding a man who possessed architectural brilliance, intimate knowledge of every inch of his prison, and absolutely zero chance of escape. He built the cage, got lured back into it, and nobody ever came looking. Which is, not ideal. Trevor's story is the moment Resident Evil quietly tells you something the heroes never want to admit. Individual competence does not defeat institutional ruthlessness. You can be brilliant, you can know every secret, and the system will swallow you whole without even pausing to chew. But if George Trevor's fate feels like the cruelest thing Umbrella ever engineered, wait until you meet something that makes corporate evil look almost quaint by comparison. Eveline. They didn't just build a weapon, they built a child. Eveline was designated an E-Series bioweapon, a parasitic organism engineered from the ground up with artificial consciousness, genuine emotional development, and the psychology of a little girl, not simulated emotions, not behavioral programming designed to mimic distress. The researchers who created her deliberately gave her the capacity to feel loneliness, abandonment, love, and fear. They made her real enough to suffer, and then they made her dangerous for suffering. Here's the thing most people miss about Eveline. She didn't choose to destroy the Baker family. Her parasitic abilities activated automatically in response to emotional distress. When she felt abandoned, when she felt unloved, her biology reached out and started rewriting the nervous systems of everyone around her. She wasn't making a decision. She was having a panic attack, and her panic attacks happened to turn people into molded. Think about that for a second. Imagine giving a child the ability to accidentally lobotomize anyone within 100 feet of her every time she cried, and then abandoning her. The Baker family is the part that breaks you. Jack, Marguerite, Lucas, Zoe. They were a normal family in rural Louisiana before Eveline arrived, and when she latched onto them, she wasn't trying to hurt them. She was trying to make them love her. She wanted a mom. She wanted a dad. She wanted to sit at the dinner table and belong somewhere. But her biology couldn't build a family without destroying one first. Every bond she formed with the Bakers corroded their neurological foundation. The harder she held on, the less of them remained. She is simultaneously the most dangerous bioweapon in the entire franchise and its most victimized creation. The people who engineered her knew exactly what they were doing. They designed a weapon that would infiltrate communities through emotional attachment, and to make that work, they had to give it a genuine need for emotional attachment. They created a child specifically so she could be weaponized by her own loneliness. That's not a villain, that's an indictment. But if Eveline's story feels like the darkest thing bioweapon development could produce, there's someone in the village who proves that parasitic infection doesn't need a child's face to be devastating. Donna Beneviento. Most of the lords in village are loud about what they are. Heisenberg won't shut up. Dimitrescu is 8 feet of but Donna Beneviento barely speaks, barely moves, and that's exactly what makes her the most unsettling one in the entire lineup. Here's her story. Before the mold ever touched her, Donna was already broken. Documents scattered through her estate paint a picture of a woman defined by isolation, anxiety, and loss. She lost her parents young. She struggled to connect with people at all. The dolls weren't a hobby. They were her only relationships. She poured everything into crafting them because they were the one thing she could control. Then Mother Miranda infected her with the Kadu parasite, and something genuinely horrible happened. It worked. Not in the way infection usually works in this franchise, where people mutate and lose themselves violently. Donna's integration was quiet, seamless. The parasite bonded with her so thoroughly that separating her own thoughts from the mold's influence became functionally impossible. And here's where it gets really dark. The mold gave Donna something she never had: purpose, belonging, a role within Miranda's family. For the first time in her life, she wasn't alone. She had a mother figure. She had siblings, even if those siblings were monsters. The parasite didn't destroy her identity, it filled the gaps in, which is, textbook cult indoctrination, except the cult leader is a centuries-old parasite queen, and the indoctrination is literally biological. Her ability to project hallucinations comes from the mold working through her psychological framework. The dolls become vessels for parasitic influence. Angie, her primary doll, functions as her voice because Donna herself can barely speak. She built a puppet to say the things she couldn't, and then a parasite crawled inside both of them. The worst part is this: you can't save Donna Beneviento, not because she's too far gone, but because she doesn't experience herself as someone who needs saving. The mold healed her loneliness. Killing her isn't a rescue mission. It's destroying the only version of her that ever felt whole. Whether that constitutes salvation or murder is a question the game never answered, and honestly, it shouldn't. But if Donna's tragedy is quiet and internal, the next one is loud, violent, and hits like a truck to the chest. Jack Baker. Jack Baker might be the most relatable monster Resident Evil has ever created, and that's exactly what makes him the hardest to stomach. Before the mold, before Eveline, before any of it, Jack was just a guy. A family man living in rural Louisiana, running a guest house, raising his kids. He loved his family, genuinely loved them. And then a little girl showed up, and everything he was started to rot from the inside out. Here's the thing that separates Jack from almost every other infected character in the franchise. His transformation wasn't instant. Jack was exposed to Eveline approximately 3 years before the events of Resident Evil 7, and the mold took him apart slowly, piece by piece, day by day. He could feel the aggression building, the impulses getting loud, the moments of clarity getting shorter, and he couldn't stop any of it. That's not a monster story. That's a hostage situation happening inside one man's brain. What makes it worse is that his emotional bonds didn't disappear. They just got weaponized. Jack still wanted his family together, but the mold twisted those attachments into mechanisms of control and violence. Love became possession. Protection became imprisonment. The dinner table became a torture chamber. The home that was supposed to be the safest place in the world became the most dangerous one. And then there's Eveline. Jack became her adoptive father figure and her parasitic servant simultaneously. At a certain point, you genuinely cannot tell where the familial instinct ends and the biological exploitation begins. They're the same thing, which is, not ideal. The developers weren't being subtle here. Jack Baker is parasitic infection as a metaphor for domestic violence. A man who loved his family, watching his own hands do terrible things to them, trapped behind eyes that can still see everything but control nothing. The house didn't change, but every room became a place where something awful could happen, because the person who was supposed to make it safe was now the source of the danger. 3 years, not 3 minutes, not 3 days, 3 years of watching yourself become the thing destroying the people you love most. But if Jack's story is about a man losing himself over years, wait until you hear about a woman who lost herself over decades and never stopped screaming the entire time. Lisa Trevor. Every backstory we've covered so far has one thing in common. Someone made a choice. Spencer chose power. Birkin chose desperation. Jack Baker was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But Lisa Trevor chose nothing. She was simply taken. Before Umbrella got their hands on her, Lisa was a young girl. That's it. That's the whole biography. She wasn't a scientist, wasn't military, wasn't connected to any conspiracy. She was just a person. And in 1967, Umbrella imprisoned her and began what would become decades of uninterrupted experimental infection. They hit her with the progenitor virus, then the T-virus, then whatever experimental agents they had lying around that week. Every new pathogen Umbrella cooked up, they pumped into Lisa Trevor because she was already there and she was already surviving. That was the entire scientific rationale. She lived through the last round, so she'd make a convenient subject for the next one. Here's where it stops being a horror game and starts being something worse. She was conscious the entire time. Decades of progressive transformation, her body twisting into something less recognizable with every new injection. And Lisa Trevor was aware of all of it. She could feel herself becoming a monster. She could feel her ability to communicate slipping away, and she couldn't do a single thing about it because the people observing her didn't see a person anymore. They saw a test subject that kept producing interesting data. The worst part isn't the experiments, it's her behavior. Even after years of infection, after her body had been warped beyond recognition, Lisa still tried to escape, still tried to reach people, still displayed every sign of a conscious mind, desperate for basic human connection, and every single person who encountered her saw a creature. Nobody looked at Lisa Trevor and thought, that's someone's daughter. Umbrella didn't keep her alive for a breakthrough. She survived the first round of infection, and that made her convenient. That's the whole story. A human life reduced to raw material because the paperwork was already filed and the cell was already occupied, and that's what Resident Evil is actually about. Not zombies, not corporations, not viruses. It's about what happens when institutions decide that a human being is just a resource to be used until there's nothing left. Every monster in this franchise was made by someone. Every single one. The horror was never the creatures. It was always the people who created them. Lisa Trevor's death wasn't a boss fight. It was mercy. And the fact that dying was the best thing that ever happened to her tells you everything you need to know about the world Umbrella. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now. Trevor's death wasn't a boss fight. It was mercy. And the fact that dying was the best thing that ever happened to her tells you everything you need to know about the world Umbrella. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.